Okay, so last week was chapter 11 of Lightfoot's book on how we got the Bible. And so just as a brief review, because it'll make a nice intro into what we're looking at today. Today we take a total fork in the road, because you have how the New Testament came to us. We finished that. And now we're into how the Old Testament came to us. And those are two separate stories, very separate. So let me show you, though, on a time scale how that works out. So we looked last week at the manuscripts in the sand. These are the these are the Greek manuscripts that come to us that are almost all written on animal skins. And you can see the century that they were penned, and the numbers are how many copies we have of that century's penned Greek manuscript. So how many actual, and this is not really all of them. This excludes a bunch. But you can see that the uncials, which are the capital letter Old Greek, are the earliest. And the 3rd century ones, there's 3 of them. Those are things like Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So those are really great. But that's what we've been spending the last 10 or 11 weeks on, is looking at those. Now, last week we showed that there were these late finds in the 19th century that were papyrus, which is highly perishable, but they still survived in the dry climates of Egypt. So we saw that those actually push back to the left, even further back. A lot of the things that we have. They're really interesting, because especially the ones in the 2nd and 3rd century, they form a basis for whether or not we ought to even trust the 3rd century uncials, which is Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. So they were the earliest ones. So these papyri basically say exactly the same thing those do. So the criticisms that have come towards Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and Alexandrinus for all those years, they're really supported by the papyrus finds. Big deal, because they were so much earlier. So that's what we looked at. Today, we're going to push the time scale even further, because we're going to go away from New Testament, and we're going to go to Old Testament. So how does the Old Testament come to us? And like I said, that's an entirely different story, because it's much, much older as well. So I'm going to take this whole chart and put on here some Old Testament manuscript finds. And they're not really finds, they're just surviving copies. And what you look at is there's this group called the Masorete traditions. And the Masoretes were just professional scribes. That's all they were. They were professional scribes. And the Jews took great care to make sure that new copies followed a strict regimen about how they were copied. That's the Masoretes. So they were anywhere from the 5th century up to the 12th century. And most of the oldest copies we have, and we'll look at them later, are Masorete tradition. The Masoretes are really nice, because they also added a wonderful thing. They realized around this time, usually around the 7th or 8th centuries, that the pronunciation of the Hebrew was becoming archaic, and no one could remember, because remember, Hebrew's written just with consonants. There's no vowels. So people were forgetting what vowels went with what words. So the Masoretes said, hey, we'll add vowels. But they didn't want to add vowels by changing the entire alphabet. You know, the alphabet, what's written in the Old Testament for them is holy. You cannot change those letters. So what they did instead was they put little dots around the letters to tell you what the vowels were. So those are called Masoretic vowel points. And you'll see some of those in a second. But before them, there were no actual notations about vowels. And then there's the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the DSS. And they, fortunately, precede the Masorete text by a lot. So the Masorete texts, the ones we really rely on today, there's 5 of them. And they were penned in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. And up until the Dead Sea Scrolls, those 2 you see in the 9th century were the oldest Hebrew we had. So, you know, compared to the New Testament, that's really interesting. Dead Sea Scrolls, I have to actually move the century scale to the left because they exist way back here. The 1st to the 3rd century before. Now that's interesting, because if these ones in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century were the oldest Hebrew we had, then this gap all the way back to before Jesus is something we can test to see how well they did transmitting the Hebrew 1,000 years, to see how accurate it is. So when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, that was a great thing to try, is to say, let's take some Old Testament text here in the 2nd century before Jesus and compare it to our oldest Hebrew text in the 9th century and see how different it is. And we're not going to talk too much about the differences, but they are just minute. They're really small. And the best one to check is that in the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have the entire scroll of Isaiah. All 66 chapters of Isaiah we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So you could take the entirety of Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls and compare it against the 9th century Masorete and just see how much it's drifted over 1,000 years of hand copying. And there are differences, but they're minute. And there've been tons of studies done on comparing those. So it's really quite a testimony to the fact that the Masoretic copies that we have in the 9th, 10th centuries are just remarkable. So let me show you the 5 that we had, the 9th, 10th, and 11th century copies. These are really without the Dead Sea Scrolls, these are the big Hebrew scrolls. It's just 5. They're all in Hebrew. That's what we're talking about. They're all in Hebrew, and they're all penned 9th century or later. So they're really quite late. That was the best that we had. If you've ever been to Israel and you go to to where they have the Dead Sea Scrolls on display, you will walk right by the first one, the Aleppo Codex. It's actually in the hallway as you walk into the Dead Sea Scrolls. But it was a big deal. So here's a picture of the Aleppo Codex, all in Hebrew. Here's a blow-up of it. So see the big letters, those are consonants in Hebrew even to this day. And the Masoretic tradition added the little dots up and above and below to tell you what the vowels are that go with it, because they did not want to actually add vowels to the alphabet. We'll just make markings to the alphabet. So, and of course, it reads from right to left, which is why all the characters sort of open to the left, and the dots tell you what the vowel is. What's underneath? You mean these things? Yeah. Those are the vowels. And on top, yeah. Those tell you what the vowel is that goes with the consonants next to it. So
3 would be C, 2 would be a B, right?
A-E-I-O-U. Yeah, so that's what those are. And again, the Masoretes said that this consonant text is holy. You do not change that. So all we'll do is basically make additions on the edges of the text. So that's what they did. If they hadn't done that, we wouldn't know how this Hebrew is pronounced today. We really wouldn't. It'd be lost. The vowels would be lost. So that's the Aleppo Codex. It has a very interesting history that we'll look at in a second. So this is exactly what it looks like if you took the letters and you transliterated them into English. Without the vowel points the Masoretes added, it would look like this. And you can sort of read that, right? Yeah, if you know it, yeah. And you know that those consonant sequences really have no other matching to any other English word. You can sort of make a guess. But what happens when you have two words that have the same consonants? Well, then you have to tell them the context. Unless you have the Masoretic vowel pointing, and then you can know what the vowels are, and you can know the word. So anyway, it has an interesting, it was penned in the 10th century, so that's the 900s. Again, it's the Masoretic tradition, and there's a specific one, Ben Asher. Ben Asher was a guy, actually not a guy, it was a whole family that was up in Tiberias near the Sea of Galilee. And so that's where they actually did this. So if you've ever been to the Sea of Galilee, over there on the western shore is Tiberias. It's still pretty much the only city on the Sea of Galilee. And that's where these guys resided for about 4 centuries. It lacks most of the Torah, that is, the first 5 books. And there's kind of a reason behind this, which causes an interesting mystery. Let me tell you the rest of the history, and I'll go back to that. So we know that it was in Jerusalem in the 10th and 11th centuries. We know that when the Crusaders came around in 1099, they took it. And they held it for ransom. Yeah. So some Egyptian Jews actually paid the ransom for it, and they got it. And then somewhere, many, many years, hundreds of years later, it shows up in Aleppo, Syria, and that's how it gets its name. Because it was in Aleppo, was where they found it. In 1947, when the UN was talking about giving Israel its state, it caused riots in all the Arab states. There were riots in Syria. And they tried to destroy this as well as all the synagogues. They did destroy all the synagogues pretty much. And they tried to destroy this. And in the process, they destroyed 193 of the 487 pages of this. But they didn't completely destroy it. And then as late as 1958, it was smuggled out of Syria into Israel. Now, the reason why this has an interesting mystery about it is that although the Torah part, the first 5 books, are non-existent from it. And you'd say, well, if they burn down the synagogues, of course, in a scroll, the first books are on the outside of the scroll, so maybe it burned the outside of the scroll in. Well, not really. They were just missing. And so the theory is that someone tried to protect the Holy Bible, which to them is the Torah, the first five books, and they ripped it off of the scroll, hoping that they could preserve it and then not have it destroyed by the writers. So a lot of people think that's happened, and there's actually 2 reasons why to believe that happened. It's because about 25 years ago, one of the sheets of those first 5 books showed up. And then, I think it's as recently as 10 years ago, another sheet showed up. So, and they can trace it historically back to this scroll. So somewhere, someone's got the Torah version of the Aleppo Codex, and someone sold a couple pages from it. Yeah, man? Well, it's a scroll. I shouldn't say codex. It was a scroll. Yeah. The Aleppo... maybe it was a codex. I might have to take that back. It might be a codex. I'm over-speaking. Yeah. It was just a single page over 25 years ago, and a single page, I think 10 years ago. My memory's faulty on that. But the only reason that the whole mystery, why the first 5 books, isn't that coincidence. The first 5 books are all gone, and there's no charring marks on the next book. Yeah, so they showed up all of a sudden. I should have gotten more information on that, but that has fueled a wonderful kind of mystery about the Aleppo Codex, that maybe someday the first 5 books will show up out of nowhere. But they were held protectively. That's what most people think. Yes, in my garage. Okay, the Leningrad Codex is a much bigger deal because it's the entirety of the Old Testament. And the first 5 books are not missing in the Leningrad Codex. And it's basically it's the foundation of all modern Hebrew from the ancient Hebrew. So here it is again. You can see the vowel points, so you can tell how to pronounce these things, and even some comments in the side margins. Kind of cool. The Leningrad Codex, penned in 1008. It really is the oldest complete manuscript, so it starts all the way from Genesis and goes through the entire Old Testament as you know it. Again, it's Masoretic in terms of the style and the transference forward. The Tiberian vowel points, Tiberius in Sea of Galilee, that's what we're talking about. We know that it showed up in Odessa in Russia in 1838. Have no clue about its prior history. It just showed up in Odessa. Poof, there it is. And from that point, it was in the Imperial Library in 1863 in St. Petersburg, but because of the revolution, St. Petersburg was renamed to Leningrad, and so after that point, it's been known as the Leningrad Codex after 24. It's really the foundational text for the Biblia Hebraica since 1937. So Biblia Hebraica is the Hebrew Old Testament standard that is actually published forward into the modern days, even to this very day. It's published forward. They're working on the 5th edition of it right now. So if you go into a bookstore and you want to buy a Hebrew text Old Testament, it's called the Biblia Hebraica, and it's almost entirely the Leningrad Codex. Almost entirely, with some modifications. Almost entirely that. It's known as the Westminster Leningrad Codex now because Westminster has done a whole bunch of research work on it, and you can see it online, which is where I got this picture on the right. You just go online, you can read it. If you can read Hebrew, you can read a Hebrew text that was penned in 1000 AD. So that's kind of fun. And of course, I just mentioned the Biblia Hebraica Quinta, which is 5 in Latin. The fifth edition is still in process right now, and it'll be complete in 2020. And you have to ask yourself, so what are they working on if it's just the Leningrad Codex? Well, there's a lot of commentaries in the midst of it and discussions about the words because there are some slight changes from some of the other codexes. So they're doing that. But they have, I just checked its status. Last time I looked at this 5 years ago, it was pretty far behind the 2020 kind of goal. I looked yesterday, and it only has 1 or 2 books that are not done. So they're probably going to hit the 2020 date. So that's the 5th edition of Biblia Hebraica. It pretty much is the Leningrad Codex. Then there's the Cairo Codex, which is a fascinating one all by itself. This is the earliest one before. I have to take that back. Penned in 895. The date is very specific, 895, because in the colophon is just a note in the front or the back of the collection that tells you the history of the document you're reading. So the authors say this document came from blah, 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 blah. And in that colophon, it says that this was penned exactly so many years after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. So you can just add it forward, and you can actually have the actual year that it was penned. So that's how they do that. 895. It was the oldest before the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So up until World War II, basically, the oldest Hebrew text we had was dated 895 AD. So that's a huge span of time. It's called the Codex Prophetarum Carensis. That's my best Latin, which means the Cairo Codex of the Prophets, because it only has prophets in it. It only has the Old Testament prophets in it. So it's got the former prophets and the latter prophets, and that's In Hebrew speaking, that the former prophets are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Prophets? Well, they call those the former prophets. And then the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. So it only has those books in it. That's it. So the Cairo Codex is just not complete. It doesn't have anything in the Torah, the first section, or even after that. By the way, did you know Torah is the Hebrew word for the first 5 books? Sometimes we'll call it the Pentateuch, Penta 5. But the Jews, when they look at the Old Testament, they think of it as Moses, the first 5 books, because that's Moses, and the prophets and the writings. They separate them in those 3 things. In fact, in the New Testament, when they talk with Jesus, he talks about Moses, the prophets, and the writings. Moses, that's the Torah, has the letter T. Prophets is Nevi'im, that has an N. And then the writings is a word that's escaping right now. Katim, I forget, but it starts with a K. So it's a T, an N, and a K, T-N-A, Tanakh. So if you ever heard a Jew talk about the Tanakh, it's just really the acronym T-N-K. T for Torah, N for prophets, K for writings, T-N-K with a little bit of vowels thrown in. So Tanakh means the entire Old Testament. Torah just means the front 5. So that's just to let you know. Okay, it was presented to the Karaite community in Jerusalem. The Karaites, by the way, even though they're a sect of Judaism, they're more like us than most of the sects of Judaism. Because what they said, the Karaites said, is that we will not believe any truth that's not written in the pages of the Bible. We do not accept what the rabbis have been talking about for thousands of years. We completely discount the rabbis' opinions. So that's the Talmudim, the Talmud. So if you hear people talk about the Talmud in the Hebrew tradition, the Talmud is the collection of the opinions of the rabbis. They say, Talmud, no, we're not going to listen to the rabbis. We're only going to go by what's on the written page. Woohoo! That was the Karaites, yeah. They're considered to be kind of crazy outliers in the Jewish community. But people recognize that if anyone can appreciate this, they will. So they gave a present to them of the Cairo Codex. And then it was taken as booty by the Crusaders in 1099. We're all embarrassed about the Crusades. Yeah. They took what was the most valuable thing and they used it to fund their crusade. So they kept them as ransom. It's like, come on, guys. So it was ransomed back to the Karaite community. Now, not in Jerusalem, but in Cairo. And the Karaite Jews, they actually did buy it. And they left Egypt and they came and they gave the Cairo Codex to the Hebrew University in 1983. So this thing has been around. But again, it's only the prophets that are contained in it. But that's a pretty big deal. Then you get to another Leningrad Codex, but this is the Leningrad Codex of the prophets. Pen 916, many times it's called the Babylonian Codex of the latter prophets. It's just got latter prophets. So again, it's like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, the 12 minor prophets. And again, the punctuation is Babylonian Masoretes. And actually, the punctuation is different from the vowel pointing, but it was discovered in this codex that they could actually put punctuation in like commas and stuff to add phrasing and sentence ends. Because there's no sentence end, there's no such thing as a period until the Babylonian Masoretes. So that was their addition on the sides to say this is an end of the sentence. Boop, and they put something in. So that's kind of cool. And then lastly, what's known as the British Library Codex. Actually, no one calls it the British Library Codex. Someone should call Neil Lightfoot and say that's a different name. But it was penned in 820. Again, the Masorah notes in the column. See those things on the right there? Those were added a century later in the 900s as it was kind of carried forward. It's usually called this, the Orientalis 4445. Isn't that catchy? That's what it's normally called. And it has Genesis 39 through Deuteronomy 1. But it turns out there's a whole bunch of numbers that are missing as well. So it's not complete, but it's got a lot of Torah. That's why it's really a good deal. Because a lot of the other codexes we have don't have any Torah in them. So that's that. So let me tell you about the Masorete tradition on scribes, what scribes did and why they call it, why it's such an important thing. What they would do is they would copy old texts into new texts, and they would have the old text in front of them, exactly like you'd think, and then they'd have a brand new, spanking brand new clean page, and they'd start copying, and they had rules for how they did the copying. And the copying is how it ensured the fact that the copies would be errorless. I mean, it was a huge tradition. You could not copy any of the Holy Scriptures unless you had Masoretic training. You couldn't touch the page. To this very day, if you go to a synagogue and they have a scroll of the Torah that's handwritten on vellum, on animal skins. Every synagogue has one. It's in their ark on the front of the place. When they pull that out, you can't touch it, and even the rabbi can't touch it. When they read it, they have a little pointer stick that has a hand on the end of it, a little tiny hand about the size of Barbie, and it's on the end of the stick, and they actually use that to point their way through the text just to follow. You can't use your finger to do it. So how do they get it out? You can touch the outside, and you can touch the rollers. You just can't touch the page. So, and that was true. That was true for the Masoretes too. What they would do when they got done, they would do a check. After they did the scribing, they'd count how many times a letter is used in a book. In the old copy, how many times the letter was used in the book, and then they would count in the new copy how many times the letter is used, and if those didn't match, they would destroy the new copy. So it was a check at the end for every letter. Another check was to note what verses that contain all the letters of the alphabet. So you'd make note of which verses have all the letters of the alphabet. You'd count how many verses have all the letters of the alphabet, and then you do that with the new copy and the old copy, and that would tell you whether you made the right copy. There was another thing they did. They would calculate the middle letter and the middle word and the middle verse of the Torah. They would actually count into the middle. And they would do that with letters, verses, and words, they would do that. The reason they would do that, they do that on the original that they were copying from, and if it did match the same result on the new one, then the new one's wrong and you destroy it. It's a check you do after the entire copy's done. So it takes a long, and the junior scribes who were not allowed to write yet were always given the task of counting the old copies and seeing, okay, the middle word is this right here in this book. And then they were also given the task of counting the new book. Couldn't touch it, but you would still count and see if it's the same. So that, I was going to say, to this day, there's a large tradition inside Judaism scribes of using numbers to do things in the Bible. So if you ever read stuff about the Bible code and how they'd read and they do stuff like that, it's because this tradition is so strong, they're still counting to this day. So, they would also calculate the middle verse of the Psalms, just as a separate. See, the other ones were the Torah. This is the Psalms. They would calculate the middle verse of the entire Tanakh. So that's Moses' prophets' writings. They'd take that entire thing and count the middle verse of that. Got nothing better to do. Now, this right here is my little nerd thing. It turns out that in digital electronics, and it happens on your phone conversation in a split second all the time, is a check of your message called a cyclic redundancy check. And what it really does is it takes your conversation, which is a series of numbers that are going across the air, and you put the numbers back together and you get sound. It takes that transmission of numbers, and it continually adds the numbers up, which doesn't mean anything. It just adds the numbers up, and it keeps adding the numbers up. And at the end of a packet of your conversation, usually about 1/10 of a second of your conversation, it comes up with a number called the CRC number, which is just the serial addition of your conversation for 1/10 of a second. And if that number doesn't agree with the same calculation made on the receiving end, the transmitting one sends it and the receiving end does it, if that doesn't agree, it throws away the data packet. It's exactly the same idea of what this is. You do this counting and adding thing, and if the numbers don't agree, you throw away a packet. So many times in your conversation, if there's dropouts in your conversation, it's not because you have a bad radio connection. It's because the CRC check data didn't check, and so it threw away the packet of data. So it's a way to actually validate the data by counting the data. It's exactly the same idea. It's exactly the same idea. It's just done in this particular case with exclusive OR logic gates. You don't care. Okay, so let's move on. So what happens with the bad ones? They're either buried or burned, they're destroyed, or they're put in a geniza. And a geniza is kind of this, I talked about this last week, I think. It's a little room that no one goes into that you just throw bad copies into because you don't have the heart to destroy them, but you put them in a place that no one can get at them. And that's the point. The idea was that the old copies were becoming faulty because the ink itself was coming off of the animal skin. So as the ink would come off the animal skins, the scribes would say, this copy is becoming unreliable because it's losing its print. So before it totally loses its print, let's make a new copy. And oh, by the way, if the new copy makes it through all the count checks, we'll call that the new authorized copy. And the old copy we don't want to let get in the hands of anybody because it'll deceive them because it's missing ink. So let's destroy it. or make it unobtainable. So that's why we don't have a lot of old copies of the Old Testament, because they systematically did, quote unquote, perfect tested copies and destroyed the old ones, so they wouldn't be misinterpreted. So that's why when I say we have two highly different ways in which the New Testament and Old Testament came to us, the Old Testament comes to us through highly structured copying processes with lots of checks, with the old copies destroyed. And that didn't happen in the New Testament, totally different. So in the Old Testament, you have this idea of a much more controlled flow of the copies coming into the modern day. The New Testament, it's like, let's just make 1 million copies and scatter them all over the Mediterranean, and let's let those poor people in the 21st century figure out which are the right words based on all these copies. So actually, both of them are good techniques to have error-free copies. Either make a ton of copies and try and administrate between them, or just make one copy that is excruciatingly, painfully error-checked. So those are the two routes that came to us. Here's a picture that Kai Organiza, it was discovered in the late 19th century, and this guy's picking through all the things that he found inside of it. I just love this picture because he's kind of going, oh, no. So he's got to figure out why they're in error to start with, and then see if there's actually any value in what's on them. So that has been an ongoing effort for over 100 years now. They still do this. Okay, next week we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And right there is a zoomed in picture of the great Isaiah scroll that was penned at least a century before Jesus. At least a century before Jesus. And if you go to Israel, you'll go to a great building in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, that the outside of it is shaped like the top of the scroll cover for the scroll that this was on. And at least when I was there in 71, they had the actual great Isaiah scroll unwrapped in this round circle behind glass. You could actually walk around it and look at the entire Isaiah scroll. Since then, it's too valuable to put on display like that, so they take a replica copy and they do the same thing. But you can walk right up to this curved glass for the whole length. They unwrap the entire scroll, and you can be this far away from looking at something that was penned for Isaiah before Jesus. So it's just really well preserved. So we'll talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because those totally changed the game on Old Testament documents. They give us 1,000 years of gap to check to see if the transmission of the Masoretes was accurate. And actually the dark period we don't know about on transmission is the time of Jesus to about the 400s, because the Masorete tradition did not exist before the 400s, well, 500s maybe. I mean, this really strict kind of copying. So who knows how it was brought forward between the time of Jesus and about 500. We don't know, 400 or 500s. But then from the 400 or 500s, we know the Masoretes had this iron rule check system. So they, for the next 1,000 years, is probably very accurate. But what about those first 500? Well, go to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They jump all the way before those 500 years and go way before Jesus. And the Dead Sea Scrolls have a mixture of age. All of them are before Jesus, and maybe as much as 250 years before Jesus. So they're a great collection to check all of this with. So that'll be next week. Do you notice something missing on this page? The dots. Those didn't come in for another 500 years. Oh no, 700 to 800 years later. There's no dots on it. These are just consonants. So, yeah. Okay, questions on that stuff?